Well, I hope you guys find what you're looking for in Alaska and get some boots on the ground and get a game plan together for over there.
We'll be fine. You're the one I'm worried about. Hopefully you can keep the rubber side down, Tyson.
Yeah, I'll do my best.
All right, I'll meet you down at the airstrip.
You're not going to believe what went down on Parker Schnabel's claim this season, just hours before he uncovered what could be the biggest jackpot of his career, a staggering 30 million in gold. His crew walked out. That's right. Engines still hot, ground half dug, Parker was staring at empty chairs and silent machines. How it unraveled, how he clawed back, and how fate turned on a dime is the kind of story that reminds us why the Yukon is the most brutal proving ground on Earth. Smash that like button, hit subscribe, and let's dive straight into the chaos. The days had been long, longer than most men could stomach. Frozen mornings where the breath froze in beards, nights where the wind howled against the canvas walls of camp, and a constant crushing pressure that came not from the Yukon itself, but from Parker Schnabel. He was driving them harder than ever, demanding another yard, another bucket, another ounce. And for a while, the crew obeyed. But cracks always show first in the silence. Muttered complaints over coffee, curses flung when bolts stripped, and tired eyes that no longer met Parker's. By midweek, it all boiled over. One breakdown, too many sent sparks flying. Literally, an excavator grinding itself to a halt while men shouted over the roar of steel on steel. Parker's orders were drowned out by fury. Enough, someone barked. We're killing ourselves for what? Another pipe dream. Helmets slammed into the dirt, hard plastic echoing across the claim. One by one, figures stormed off, boots crunching on frozen gravel until headlights cut through the dark. Half the crew was gone, swallowed by the night, engines roaring down the road and leaving behind silence so heavy it felt cursed. Parker stood alone, his machines cooling like corpses, the ground stretching wide and empty before him. But the Yukon doesn't wait for anyone. The next morning, Parker gathered the few who hadn't bolted. Their faces were pale, hollowed by exhaustion, yet they stayed. Around the fire, names of deserters were spat like venom, but the silence afterward spoke louder. Everyone knew what it meant. The work had doubled, and the odds had turned against them. Whispers spread through camp. Some muttered that Parker had finally pushed too hard, blinded by greed. Others whispered of something else, that Parker wasn't just digging for ounces. He was chasing a legend. A rumor passed from old-timers about a hidden pocket of gold so vast it had cursed anyone who went looking for it. Nearby, rival miners circled like wolves, ready to pounce on what they believed was abandoned ground. The Yukon shows no mercy for weakness. If Parker faltered now, the vultures would strip his cut bare before the week was out. And so, with ice in his veins and fire in his gut, he gambled everything on one move. He chose a cut his men had dismissed as worthless. A hole on the maps marked "played out," a dead claim generations had abandoned. Everyone thought it was madness. Parker thought otherwise. The hollow cut, they called it. An old wound in the earth, scarred from picks and shovels of long-dead miners. By all accounts, it was empty. But Parker had noticed what no one else did, the way the soil shifted oddly underfoot, the patches of black sand streaking through the gravel, the faint shimmer in pan tests that others had written off as nothing more than mica. It wasn't proof, but in Parker's gut, it was a sign. The ground there felt wrong. Mud clung to boots like tar. Rocks weighed heavier than they should. Something was buried deep, something that didn't want to be found. The men who remained looked at him with hollow eyes, whispering about Yukon curses, wasted fuel, and certain failure. Still, Parker didn't flinch. He raised his hand, pointing at the gaping maw of the hollow cut. "Run it," he said, voice low but unshakable. "Trust the ground." Engines roared to life, swallowing their doubts as steel tore into earth. The camp held its breath, waiting for the cut to speak. Hours crawled, diesel smoke thickened, exhaustion pressed on every shoulder. Machines groaned under the load, sluice mats clogging with black sand until the pumps choked and sputtered. Then came the order no one wanted to hear. Shut down. Silence fell, broken only by the hiss of cooling engines and the slap of rain against steel. Parker stalked forward, boots sinking in the muck, and peeled back the mats himself. What lay beneath froze every breath. Against the black slurry, bright streaks shone like fire. Not flakes, not dust, nuggets, thick and fat, tumbling free as the mats rolled back. The crew stood still, eyes wide, until one man finally reached down and hefted a piece the size of a thumb. It was real, heavier than any of them expected, and then another and another. The pit that generations had written off as dead was bleeding gold like a fresh wound. Above them, the Yukon storm roared. Lightning ripped the sky open, thunder shaking the ground under their boots, as though the earth itself resisted giving up its treasure. Rain sheeted across the claim, turning the gravel dark, while sluice water ran yellow with promise. In the chaos, Parker didn't shout. He didn't grin. He bent low, scooping a handful of nuggets into his palm, the metal cold against his skin, and whispered so low only the storm heard him. "This isn't chance. This is history waking." Word traveled faster than any truck. Within days, whispers of Parker's impossible strike were slipping into bars along the Klondike Highway, carried by truckers, rival miners, and camp hands who couldn't keep quiet. A dead cut suddenly alive, a kid striking gold where old men had sworn there was none. It was the kind of story the Yukon loved, and the kind of story that drew men like moths to flame. Then, as if the storm itself had spat them back out, the deserters began to return. Trucks pulled into camp one by one, headlights cutting through the misty mornings, doors opening on men who only days before had cursed Parker's name. They came quiet, eyes low, boots dragging through the mud. Some offered apologies, words tumbling over themselves as though sheer regret might buy their way back into the fold. Others came harder, defiant, claiming they had only left to cool off, insisting they'd been right there with him all along. Parker listened. He said nothing at first, his face set hard, his jaw clenched against the weight of it all. Then slowly, he shook his head. Not all would return. Not this time. The strike was too big, the stakes too high to welcome back every man who had abandoned him in the storm. Some he let stay, measuring loyalty in the quiet strength of their eyes. The rest, he turned away with nothing but silence, his refusal colder than any curse. The reactions split as sharp as a pick's edge. A few accepted their fate, climbing back into trucks and driving into the darkness, shame trailing them like exhaust. Others begged on their knees, voices cracking, fists clenching in desperation. And a few, their pride deeper than any wound, spat venom into the mud and swore revenge before disappearing into the trees. By the time the sun rose over camp, Parker's world was cut in two. Inside the walls, those building a legend, and outside, those seething with envy. But inside, the legend grew. Cleanouts began to reveal the kind of gold no miner dares dream aloud. Trays bent under the weight of nuggets, so dense that two men strained to lift them. The sluice boxes ran like veins themselves, pumping streams of yellow brighter than any claim in memory. For days, Parker refused to let excitement slip into chaos. The work continued, each run another test of endurance, each clean-out another revelation. Finally, unable to trust only his eyes, Parker called in experts. Assayers with decades of experience stooped over the glittering piles, weighing, measuring, testing. Their verdict left the camp silent. The purity was higher than anything the Yukon had seen in generations, the kind of clean, untouched gold that seemed almost mythic. This wasn't a vein trickling into gravel. This was something else, something sealed, hidden, and waiting. Parker stood over the mountain of treasure, watching numbers climb into tens of millions. The gold poured like a vault, cracked open, as though the earth had guarded it until now. He should have smiled. He should have cheered. Instead, unease rippled through the camp. "This isn't mining," one old hand muttered, voice quivering with awe and fear. "This is uncovering something buried for a reason." The jackpot had awakened, and with it, the Yukon's oldest curse. And curses never stay silent for long. The storms had barely cleared when the first wave of trouble came crashing in. Rivals caught the scent. $30 million worth of gold was too loud a call to ignore. They arrived not with shovels, but with paper. Surveyors pacing borders, lawyers waving claims, trucks circling at the camp's edge. The skeleton crew that had nearly fallen apart now found themselves surrounded, their cut no longer a mine, but a fortress under siege. It didn't take long before shadows crept into the work itself. Hoses left coiled and tight one evening were sliced open by morning, bleeding water into the mud. Fuel drums drained mysteriously overnight, leaving machines dead and silent at dawn. Tires that had held strong all season now split in ugly tears as though knifed under the cloak of darkness. Some whispered that rivals were behind it. Others, more superstitious, muttered about something older, something buried with that gold, never meant to see the light. But Parker didn't believe in curses. He believed in eyes watching from the tree line. The buzzing confirmed it. Drones hung in the Yukon night sky, their red lights blinking like predators, marking prey. Someone was tracking his every move, every cleanup, every tray brimming with impossible weight. And when word spread, 30 million in gold pulled from a single grue, the Yukon itself seemed to tense, the whole territory watching as history bent in Parker's direction. So he fortified. Nightfall no longer meant rest. Trucks were parked with headlights beaming into the dark, sweeping like watchtowers. Crews rotated in shifts, armed with nothing but flashlights, radios, and the grit that kept them tied to Parker's command. The pit became a battlefield disguised as a gold claim. The mud-slick walls their trench, the roaring storm above their only cover. Thunder rolled overhead, rain slashed sideways, and more than once the rising flood threatened to swallow the cut hole. It was as if the land itself rejected what they were pulling free, shaking and tearing to reclaim its buried secret. Still, they dug, and still, the gold came, thick, stubborn, endless. Sluice mats clogged under sheer weight, cleanups pushing men to breaking as trays bent in their hands. The numbers, once whispered, became undeniable. Millions more added every day, the jackpot swelling like a living thing that refused to stop breathing. And yet with every ounce, the pressure grew sharper. Men swore they heard voices in the wind at night, low guttural warnings to stop, to cover the ground again. A few crossed themselves before running the wash plant. Others stopped speaking altogether, working in silence, eyes darting at shadows as though listening for whispers that weren't there. And then came the men Parker had already denied, the deserters. Shamed once, they returned now, not in humility, but in venom, carrying bitterness like a weapon. They haunted bars and roadside diners, spreading stories designed to rot Parker's name from the inside out. They called him reckless, cursed, accused him of stealing from land that should have been left alone. Locals began to wonder if Parker's cut was gold or grave, and the whispers cut deeper than any knife to the tires. Inside camp, the loyal crew burned themselves out to prove otherwise. They pushed beyond exhaustion, working double shifts with cracked hands and mud-streaked faces, fueled not by wages, but by the raw fever of being part of something no Yukon miner would ever see again. Parker chose carefully among those who begged to come back, granting only a few the right to return. He trusted nothing but instinct, who looked him in the eye, who didn't flinch, who had no tremor of betrayal hiding behind their voice. But those locked out wouldn't go quietly. They appeared at the gates drunk and furious, fists flying, voices echoing into the night. Brawls broke out in the mud. Yukon justice dealt with boots and bare knuckles before headlights scattered the chaos. Men staggered back into the dark, swearing vengeance, spitting curses into the storm. And through it all, Parker stood unbroken, his eyes locked on the pit, deeper than ever before. Because even after millions had poured from the sluices, he knew it wasn't finished. The jackpot wasn't a vein, wasn't a fluke. It was a vault, and vaults never give up half their treasure. Somewhere beneath the muck and stone, Parker believed the heart of it still waited, heavier than anything they had pulled yet. That certainty carried him into the night. Lanterns hissed against the Yukon dark, flames throwing shaky shadows across a camp that had seen too much. The crew gathered in a tight circle, boots sinking into churned mud, eyes fixed on the mountain of blackened trays stacked high in the center, each tray brimmed with raw gold, thick, wet, clinging to steel like it refused to be measured. Nobody spoke as Parker stepped forward, jaw clenched, hands steady. The scales waited, old and scarred, but still honest. The first pour hit like thunder. Gold slid out in a dense wave, clattering against metal, the needle snapping forward before finding its balance. 1,000,000. The second tray followed, then a third, and suddenly the numbers leapt too fast for breath. 10,000,000. 15. The camp held its air in one lung, every man's heart pounding in time with the shifting scale. Sweat dripped down faces that had stared at mud and gravel for months, now watching history take shape in a pile of yellow. By 20 million, the whispers started, rippling through the men like fire across dry brush. Impossible, someone muttered. Another hissed, it's still climbing. Each tray poured heavier than the last, each thump of gold on steel pushing them deeper into disbelief. When the final tray was lifted, carried like a crown, the crew leaned forward as though pulled by gravity. The gold poured out slow, deliberate, and the scales groaned under its weight. The needle steadied, and silence swallowed the night. Over 30 million. For a moment, nobody moved, nobody breathed. Then the camp erupted, men shouting, fists punching the air, voices cracking in disbelief. Some dropped to their knees in the mud, laughing until tears streaked their faces. Others clutched each other, howling like wolves. But Parker stood still, his shadow long across the lantern light. His voice cut through the noise, low and sharp. It almost broke us before it gave in. The words hung heavy, silencing the celebration into something raw, something truer. Because every man there knew it was no exaggeration. The cut had nearly destroyed them. By dawn, The story had already escaped the camp. Across the Yukon, radios buzzed and phones lit up. Parker Schnabel had pulled the richest ground since the old rushes. Legends once spoken of in whiskey halls were alive again, not in books, but in mud and metal. Historians compared it to the Klondike strikes that built empires. Old-timers shook their heads, admitting they'd never seen numbers like it in their lifetime. The Yukon, for a brief moment, bent its neck toward Parker. But the deserters heard too. Men who had walked away in anger and pride now knew they had left hours before fortune flipped. They had thrown away destiny in exchange for bitterness, and the sting was unbearable. Some tried to crawl back into the story, begging forgiveness, offering loyalty too late. Others spat Parker's name with venom, cursing him as though their own cowardice wasn't to blame. Beyond them, larger predators moved. Governments drafted letters, reminding Parker of taxes, permits, obligations. Corporations circled like hawks, already calculating what they could buy, what they could seize. Offers came in with more zeros than any man could comprehend. Promises of partnerships, infrastructure, security. But Parker knew the truth. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about something older, something carved into his bones since the first day he stepped onto ground with a pan and a dream. This was destiny, and destiny, he knew, never came free. The land itself seemed to rise against him in proof. Within days of the jackpot tally, storms ripped across the Yukon, howling winds tearing at machinery, floods chewing through supply lines. A dozer slid into the pit, nearly taking 2 men with it. A cable snapped, whipping across the yard with lethal speed. Each accident felt less like coincidence and more like the earth clawing back what had been stolen. Whispers ran through camp again. The ground demands payment. Rivals stoked the fire, their voices carrying into every bar and back road. They called Parker cursed, his fortune poisoned by greed and betrayal. No man pulls that much gold without blood attached, one said. The words spread as quick as the legend itself. And soon Parker's camp wasn't just famous, it was feared. He stood in the center of it all, surrounded by a mountain of gold that glowed dull under stormlight. Enemies pressed in from the outside, dangers gnawed from within, and still the jackpot gleamed, silent and heavy as judgment. Parker stared at it, mud streaked across his face, exhaustion burning behind his eyes. He whispered, not to his crew, not to the storm, but to the weight itself. This isn't the end. It's only the beginning. The words carried into the night, swallowed by the wind. For Parker Schnabel, the gold wasn't a finish line. It was a door, and beyond it, the Yukon waited with teeth bared.